Donc, après une première table ronde sur la problématique des énergies renouvelables dans le cadre de la ZLECAf, on va enchaîner, toujours dans le cadre de la ZLECAf, avec une autre problématique, celle de l'agrobusiness. Je suppose que, je ne sais pas s'il y a parmi vous des hommes d'affaires qui ont investi dans l'agrobusiness en Afrique, ce serait sympa de vous avoir. Mais l'idée, c'est d'aborder cette question en lien avec l'exigence de sécurité alimentaire et voir dans quelle mesure, justement, cet agrobusiness impacte l'agriculture locale en Afrique. Et pour mener, en fait, cette table ronde-là, j'ai la chance et l'honneur d'accueillir Hector Guerra, qui va nous animer cette table ronde. Et Hector, c'est un membre d'Africa 21, mais surtout un spécialiste de la diplomatie et de la politique de désarmement. Je crois qu'il est assez modeste sur certaines informations, mais je vais le dire quand même. Et il a contribué notamment à l'action intégrale contre les mines, à la campagne internationale pour l'abolition des armes nucléaires, qui a débouché sur l'attribution du prix Nobel de la paix à la structure avec qui il a collaboré notamment. Donc, merci à toi, Hector, d'être avec nous ce matin. Et pour les interventions, on aura notamment M. Peter Gumbok et M. Komi Sowu qui sera en ligne. Il est en ligne, donc bonjour à tous. Et l'idée, c'est quoi? C'est tout simple. Il y a qu'aujourd'hui, la ZLECAf, on parlait tout à l'heure de potentiel économique. Ce potentiel-là a de nombreux atouts, notamment pour le monde agricole, pour la politique agricole qu'on peut qualifier de commune pour l'Afrique, mais surtout le monde des affaires qui touche l'agriculture en Afrique. Et on espère que ce potentiel pourra permettre à l'Afrique, notamment aux différents acteurs, aux populations notamment, d'impulser une dynamique d'industrialisation qui, bien que cela favorise le marché agricole en Afrique, puisse surtout donner de nouvelles opportunités pour la sécurité alimentaire en Afrique. C'est un sujet dont on parle dans toutes les structures onusiennes notamment. Le PNUD œuvre largement pour ces différentes questions, mais on doit réfléchir quand même à comment on fait le choix de la durabilité pour qu'il y ait des équilibres entre les différents modes agricoles. Et dans ce cadre-là, quels sont les impacts de l'agrobusiness sur l'agriculture locale comme enjeu et la garantie de la sécurité alimentaire, notamment pour les populations. Donc, Hector, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you today in what is the second panel of the day and the third one on the impact of free trade, continental free trade, on different aspects of sustainable development in Africa. My esteemed colleagues this morning, they bring a wealth of experience and expertise that will address the question of how an African continental free trade agreement will impact local agriculture and food security in a continent where agriculture remains of paramount importance. We'll begin with a round of presentations by our two panelists, which will be followed by space for their own exchange for questions and comments among themselves. And after that, we'll open the floor for our Q&A section. Just one quick announcement. There has been a change in the program. Mr. Zuma won't be joining this panel today. Now, without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Komi Sowu, who will be joining us online, I understand from the Comoros. He is the UNDP regional advisor for the AfCFTA and project manager of UNDP Africa. Mr. Tsuwo, you have up to 15 minutes for your presentation, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I just want to confirm that you can hear me. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thanks. Yes, so it's a pleasure to be here. I've been, I think, in UNCTAD in Geneva for many years, so it's always good to see colleagues and previous friends. Now, you know, I'm going to quickly present. I know you have been hearing since yesterday what the AfCFTA is, but the angle now we are taking is the potential impacts first on agribusiness, but also on food security. But first, I think it's also good to put the AfCFTA in context. As we all know, the continent is quite fragmented. We have about 20 countries with a population less than 10 million. This week, for instance, we are organizing, you know, we are supporting the government of Comoros to organize this ministerial conference on seed and brew economy and potential for AfCFTA. And the seeds, you know, the whole the population of each of the seed on the continent is below 2-3 million. So this, and most importantly, trade across the continents, you know, is frustrated by so many land borders, and we don't, you know, even count most of time those maritime borders as well. Basically, for a continent on the size, maybe in terms of population, India and others, we have so many small economies that's quite frustrating competitiveness. So the idea, as you know, is really to integrate the continent through the AfCFTA. Now, the AfCFTA, as I usually say, is more than a trade agreement. But we also know that when you look at the 4 dimensions of the food security, availability, access, utilization, of course, and stability of all those dimensions, 2 key dimensions of food security are linked directly with the AfCFTA, which is reducing or eliminating barriers, whether non-tariff barrier or non-tariff barriers on goods across the continent. For instance, when we take the dimension of availability of food, whether through domestic production or trade, and we know across the continent, for instance, that a number of regions are still suffering a lot of droughts, Horn of Africa, Sahel, and others. And what the AfCFTA is bringing in that case is really to eliminate tariffs on those key products, or also streamline tariff procedures to elimination of non-tariff barriers. Of course, the AfCFTA is also making sure countries are not imposing quotas on trade, whether import or export anymore. So this will directly impact availability of food from one region to another on the continent. Of course, it will also impact on food access. We know that some countries today across the continent impose up to 90%, 90% on some of the foods that are coming from within the continent. So this AfCFTA will also make sure that those taxes are progressively eliminated for the continent, at least for people to be able to also have economic and physical access to those food that are produced within the continent with lesser tariffs and non-tariff barriers. We have also many countries that within the continent that usually will ban exports, sometimes due to political reason, but sometimes due to internal production issues. Normally, if the AfCFTA is again implemented by all the countries effectively, we will not see those bans anymore. But of course, as I said, The AfCFTA has also a strong rules of origin. Basically, these are the process to which you have to comply to before you get the trade preferential treatment. I think most of you in Geneva are quite familiar. So the AfCFTA's rule of origin are quite strict. Then we hope those will also promote, development of regional value chain. We are seeing some of those coming and agri-foods is one of the sectors where we expect more of impact. I'm sure, because this is where we are also actually trading a lot currently within the continent. Now, there are also other issues that are dealt with, as you know, in the agreement, trading services, logistic and or transportation, which is quite important to be able also to make sure foods and other goods are transported from one area to another. We also have digital trade protocol, and I'm also sure that what COVID has taught us is really that the continent needs to really digitalize. And we have seen emergence or scale up in terms of investment on digital infrastructure since COVID, and a lot of businesses now onboarding on e-commerce platforms on the continent. This will also facilitate trade of goods and so and so. There is also a specific protocol on women and youth in trade. We know that within the continent, the producer of agricultural product and traders, they are mainly women entrepreneurs also. So the AfCFTA is also looking into dedicated provisions to make sure those usual barriers that women and youth are facing are addressed through dedicated protocol. I think this is probably the first agreement that will have full dedicated protocol for women and youth. There are other aspects, for instance, of food security, utilization, which will not really have direct linkage with the AfCFTA, but of course, when you have better access to the food, you also expect in terms have better access to diversified food. So that's really the key element here will probably be availability of food and access, low-cost access, since tariffs are going to be reduced. But how concretely this is going to be done? I want to also here talk about quickly a few of those instruments in the AfCFTA that will help streamline trade process. Of course, the first one, as I said, is a rule of origins. These are quite strict to really make sure that those goods that are going to be traded duty-free within the continent are made within are processed within the continent. We also have online tariff portal where people can go, anyone can go and check the existing tariffs, and so I will demonstrate that. Non-tariff barrier mechanism, we know how non-tariff barriers within the continent impacts, the goods trading in goods, especially perishable good food. So within this context, there is a mechanism that has been developed by the AfCFTA Secretariat, AUC, and UNCTAD to really make sure that those barriers, non-tariff, are reported and addressed as we implement. Another very important instrument that will really help trade across the continent and food security and value, and those agribusiness as well, is a Pan-African payment system developed by Afrique Bank and the AfCFTA Secretariat. We all know currently that most of African countries, if you are in Nigeria, and you want to deal with your partner in Ghana, you can't use Naira or cedis, for instance, which are the national currency. You have to always pass through USD or other international currency. Basically, what the Pan-African payment system is doing is to make sure that you can use your national currency to buy, let's say, or to pay your supplier for another country. As a business, you will not need to look into international currencies, and then the system will, of course, take care of that. But you pay, if you are in Nigeria, you pay in Naira. If you are exporter, you get your revenue in Naira. So this will really help the continent trade within itself. And there are a number of other instruments as well, African Trade Observatory, that will tell you where the market opportunities are. So these are really tools for businesses, but also for those traders and non-traders that will face challenges when trade across the borders. In terms of tariff liberalization, what I want to show here is that actually up to 90% of tariff line, but let's call it for goods, for those who are not trade experts, will be liberalized. Basically, over a certain period of time, progressive liberalization of tariff will happen for the goods after 5 years when it's non-LDC country, and 10 years for LDCs, for the tariff, existing tariff, to be zero. But one important element I want to also highlight here is that within the context of the liberalization, there are also a group of products, a 3% of line of products that will be excluded for the liberalization, which means countries still have room to protect some sector. And specifically what the head of state of the African Union has decided, you can also use food security as a reason to avoid opening a specific sector. Probably you are maybe a country like, let's say, Madagascar, where rice is produced but imported. So maybe they can exclude, rice for liberalization scheme if they really feel like this will threaten their food security. And so these are exceptions that exist, but clearly food security is could be one of the reasons a country can protect a market. Concretely, how this liberalization is happening, here I'm taking a case of rice and some other product from a country X to Z. I think I took Cameroon and Egypt here. What you can see, the MFN rates is actually the rates at the beginning of current rates that apply between the two countries. So with progressive liberalization over, for instance, over 10 years when it comes to this group of rice, which mean countries Z will then reduce tariffs over that specific period. And it's linear, a reduction from 5%, 4.5, and it's 0.5 decrease every year, so that after 10 years, it then becomes 0%. Of course, this progressive liberalization will also help government to mitigate the shock of tariff losses. And the time is 5 years for some group of country, but 10 years from other groups. So this is concretely to tell us that, yes, the AfCFTA is going concretely to reduce those import tariffs that usually countries are putting on some goods. And here we are in the case of rice, which is quite important for food security on the continent. Now, when we look into a number of items, here, basically what I did is just to pick some data, what currently the continent over a period, continent is importing from the world, which is the bar in red, and what actually is coming from within the continent to look into the market that exists. And across all products, whether they are foods products or non-food products, we can clearly see that what is actually coming from the continent, from those products, represent a small share from what the continent is still importing from the world market. And this actually, as we all know, increased vulnerability of the continent when crises come. We have seen how the continent has suffered in importing some basic food products during COVID, but also during the crisis in Ukraine, which has impacted price in local market when it comes to those maize and cereals that are usually imported from those continents, those countries. So basically, we do believe, and I personally do believe, that the AfCFTA will contribute. I will not say it will fully do that, but will contribute to address some of those issues where the continent can trade with itself. As I said, this week we are in Comoros, for instance, to discuss the blue economy potential, fishery. And you can see here the fish and fresh product have, the continent still, importing a lot from outside. Why we have so many countries, whether the seeds, the islands, whether small islands or not, and coastal countries, and the fishery, the potential of tuna here, for instance, in Comoro, where I'm this week, is quite huge, but they don't even have the cold facility. So how can you then, trade if you don't have the basics? So these are challenges also we need to address. The AfCFTA is not going to solve all the problems. So the AfCFTA need to be accompanied, followed by a number, quite huge investment in infrastructure, those cold facilities to be able to also keep goods flows from one country to another. Of course, when it comes to the value chain, I want to give an example here of the cocoa global value chains. I've worked a lot, and we all like chocolates. So I like the cocoa sector personally. But what's happening, I know it's also quite of high interest in Geneva when it's come to the cocoa, because how the country, Switzerland, is a big players in the cocoa beans and chocolate market. Now, what's happening clearly here is that we have taken some of those value-added contents from countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Cameroon, compared to Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, to see where actually the value are being created. And we all know when we come to the continent, most of the value we create is at the beans level. That's why we have a huge proportion of the blue, which is quite the cocoa bean sectors. While when we go to similar developing countries in Indonesia and Malaysia and Brazil, actually, most of the value are created at the cocoa butter and cocoa powder stage, and even chocolate. So those countries have been able to add value. Yeah, there are many reasons that will explain that, but partly because those are better integrated to their regional market. This is also what we are showing here in terms of participation of those countries to the regional value chains. And we can see how the percentage of participation, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Ghana, is quite limited vis-a-vis Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brazil, which have better integration to their regional and global market. So what we will see probably, and we hope to see with the AfCFTA again, is to be able to help countries in the continent to be able to trade themselves. When it comes to cocoa, we have, for instance, industry, chocolate manufacturing industry in South Africa and Botswana and some countries in Southern Africa really want to be able to import those beans of powder from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And currently, it's a bit challenging when you add those tariffs, but we do hope that by removing those tariffs on the cocoa beans, those countries will be able to trade, and we will probably, hopefully see development of the cocoa value chains within the continent. But we still know that some of those value chains, the main markets remain in Europe, in US, and in China. But certainly there will be more value added because of the trading potential between the continent by the AfCFTA. And this is also one of the sector we are looking into, dairy market. We know, for instance, dairy product milk are quite important, especially in some region, Eastern, Southern Africa, North Africa, and other as well, in terms of the basic food needs. What I'm showing here is on the first graph on the left side is the export of dairy product by Eastern African region. Basically, what that graph is showing is that most of the dairy products that is exported by the Eastern African region, whether to the continent or to the world, remain actually within the region. That means the East African countries are trading more among themselves. But when we go now to look into the import of dairy products by African countries, we are importing mainly from the milk product from European Union, but surprisingly also from New Zealand. And we know how far New Zealand is from, again, the continent. But because of the maritime roads that are cheaper to trade with, so the continent continue to rely, which mean again that for the AfCFTA to work, for the businesses, agro-food value chains within the continent, we need to invest also a lot in infrastructure to reduce the cost. Again, the AfCFTA is not like baton magique, if we can say that. So it's really important that we consider all those factors when we are looking into this. Now, in terms of, in a nutshell, what we have seen as potential winners, those sectors from the AfCFTA, agro-food products, of course. We have also seen that fertilizer is quite important to be able to, will be one of the winning sector for AfCFTA. Recently, a few years ago, there has been, for instance, agreement between Nigeria and Togo for Togo to be able to supply phosphates to the fertilizer plants of Dangote in Nigeria. That's not only proof of regional value chains that will be created, but also this means that the continent is ready to trade more with itself, but it needs also a lot of investment into agribusiness and others. Of course, if we are able to produce fertilizer within the continent, then we also able to also increase, use of it and productivity. Of course, there will be a lot of discussion probably around the impact of increased use of fertilizer on soil and so and so. But at least from the production side, this will contribute to increase productivity. But of course, we also have a number of opportunities in services, and we know service sector are quite catalyst element to trade of goods. So these are some of the issues we are looking into, but we do believe those sectors will come with high potential. There are a number, as I said, I think the AfCFTA is not a baton magique. Implementation is quite important. There are countries, actually 7, 8 countries that have started implementing it. Some countries are taking sometimes to start because of mini region, which we can also discuss if questions are raised. But in a nutshell, this is what I want to talk to. There are potential impacts of AfCFTA on food security, direct application on agro-businesses, but implementation will be key to realize those potential, and any mitigation measures should be also put in place if there are those risks. I think I will just stop here and looking forward to the question and the discussions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsowo. Very, very interesting presentation. Just would like to add that Mr. Tsowo, in his various roles at the United Nations, advises both public and private actors across Africa and beyond on various issues ranging from trade, industrialization, value chains, development, including within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Once again, sir, thank you very much for your presentation. And now to the audience here in the room and online, please, I encourage you to ask questions, comments. We'll save them to the Q&A section. And si vous voulez le faire en français, on va vous aider à traduire les questions en anglais. Okay, thank you very much. Now we will listen with interest to Mr. Peter Lunenburg. He's Senior Program Officer at the South Center. He's been a member of the UNCTAD Working Group on Commodities. You have up to 15 minutes for your presentations. Your presentation, now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You're hearing me clearly? Okay, thank you. So I'm a senior program officer in the trade program of the South Center. So we are dealing there with all the issues that are being negotiated, discussed in the World Trade Organization and also in free trade agreements. So we have been very active in the EPA's negotiation, advising and analyzing the EPAs. And also more recently, the AfCFTA. Now, the question is, what is the contribution of AfCFTA to the development of agribusiness? I would say right now, the impact is zero. Because this agreement entered into force on 30 May 2019, 4 years ago, but is not really implemented. As Mr. Comey said, implementation is very important. When this agreement was adopted, there were many empty gaps. There were no tariff schedules, so there is no preferential trade. There was no services schedules, so there is no preferential service trade. So in a way, it was an empty shell with here and there some commitments that go beyond WTO. Then, of course, we had COVID. So basically, the impact of CFTA on anything has been marginal. Of course, the question is, what will be the impact? So I will just give some insights into the process. Now, first of all, what is happening with the tariff schedules? Because any free trade agreement, almost anywhere in the world, when it is adopted, it already has the tariff schedules, right? It already has everything included while it is adopted. Of course, for reasons of expediency, that was not done for the CFTA to show, we have a result, but in effect, there was not a result. So basically the last 4 years, there have been negotiations to actually have tariff schedules, to have preferential trade on the African continent. Now, there were all kinds of legal issues with actually doing that, because if you look at Annex 1 of that agreement, it says that all state parties should adopt schedules at one point in time, and they should categorize, as Mr. Comey said, everything in A, B, and C. But of course, that is never going to happen, because some states, they don't want, some states are they have more consultations. So actually, there was a legal innovation needed to allow for schedules to come into the CFTA. So for that purpose, a ministerial directive was adopted to have provisional schedules of tariff concessions. Now, these provisional schedules, they are mainly to implement the first 90% of tariff lines. And at the last ministerial meeting that happened on the 31st of May this year, there was some success, because the schedule of SACU, which is the Southern African Customs Union, and Morocco were adopted. But what does this mean? It means, for the moment, nothing. So for the moment, we have 42 of these provisional schedules, but right now they are not implemented. Formally, they should be implemented. And in fact, for some countries, it would mean immediate tariff liberalization quite rapidly. So for example, Algeria, they have to liberalize in 5 years. And ministers have agreed that the so-called start of trading, what you maybe heard about, is the 1st of January 2021. In fact, it means the date of the first tariff cut. So if everybody now starts to implement on the 1st of January 2024, and they need to actually follow the current rules, then Algeria, for example, should actually reduce with 80%, because it's already the 4th year. 1 of January 2024 is actually the 4th year of implementation. of the tariff schedules. So the question is actually whether that will be done or not. So we'll see. But at least the groundwork is there to have preferential trade among African countries. But just we have to have reality check at the moment. That is not. Now, at the same ministerial meeting that happened at the end of May, there was discussion on a proposal on front-loading basic agricultural products. As Mr. Comey rightly pointed out, I mean, there are certain products where Africa is highly dependent on extra-continental imports. So in that proposal, there was an analysis actually for many agricultural products. Some agricultural products, if the schedules are implemented, the trade would be relatively free for some products. So those products would include, wheat, soybean seeds, crude soybean oil, meaning that if they were produced in Africa, the trade would be relatively free. But the same analysis showed that actually many agricultural products are actually not categorized as A. So they would not be subject to preferential trade. And these products actually include actually the tradable products like sugar, wheat flour, maize flour, and dairy. So in fact, nothing will happen in terms of intra-African trade for those products. And of course, sugar, for example, I mean, actually, if you look at chocolate, I mean, we had the example of chocolate. I mean, cacao is not a major ingredient of chocolate. You know, it's probably sugar. So the question is whether preferential trade first is not implemented, and secondly, if implemented, how much would it actually affect trading and investment decisions? It is questionable. But this proposal on front-loading basic agricultural products was actually trying to raise attention to this and saying, hey, maybe we should focus more attention on liberalizing trade in agricultural on the African continent. Now, at this meeting, the ministers looked at it. They said, well, we know this, you know, it is an idea. Maybe we take this into account when we review the AfCFTA. In fact, every 5 years, the CFTA should be reviewed. And actually, the first review is already in 2024. So, but basically, what it means politically, it means, okay, we have seen it and we discussed other things. That's basically what it means. I would say personally, the idea is probably laudable, but we shouldn't look only at basic agricultural products. I mean, we have been talking about value chains for ages. So it's not only about basic agricultural products, it's also about fertilizer. It's about soil, all the soil amendment products. It's about, you know, basic agricultural equipment. So if you want to discuss this again next year, as the ministers agreed, these issues should be taken into account. Of course, I think my microphone is a bit, okay. Yeah, so is this better? Yeah. Another reason why looking at this might be of interest is that actually duty exemptions right now are a major source of corruption in many African countries, like the import of edible oils, for example, in Nigeria or Kenya. In fact, you know, the reason that there are high duties and then, you know, the duty exemption that can be given at the moment, discretionary, actually is a big source of corruption. So in fact, eliminating or reducing the duties for everybody without this discretion might reduce corruption. So that is on preferential tariff. But the CFTA has other provisions that speak to improving agricultural trade. Of course, one of them is SPS, so-called sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Now here, again, implementation, the proof is in implementation. Of course, it has very nice provisions. In fact, it has provisions that's call upon the state parties to have common test facilities, to have common SPS infrastructure. It has provisions on on technical consultations, and also to have a subcommittee to discuss, if those technical consultations don't work out, to discuss them. It talks about development of regional SPS standards. So in fact, these are very good provisions, but again, the subcommittee on SPS at the AfCFTA level has the responsibility to encourage state parties to actually work it out. And then finally, and Mr. Comey also referred to that on trade facilitation. Now, there are 3 annexes that talk about trade facilitation: customs cooperation, trade facilitation, and transit. If you look at all the commitments that's there, it mainly reflects what was already agreed in the WTO. So what is actually interesting for the CFTA is actually what goes beyond the WTO. I mean, it's not interesting to look what is already agreed, right? It's interesting what goes beyond, or what is different from WTO. And what is actually different in the CFTA in the area of trade facilitation? It is essentially about transit. Transit facilities, transit guarantees, and things like that. The trade facilitation measures for authorized operators, commitments related to perishable products, and also the exchange of import prohibition lists. Now, in fact, several countries on the continent, for example, Nigeria, they have import prohibition lists. And in fact, on those import prohibition lists, actually many agricultural products figure. So in fact, more transparency on that, might help to have discussion on it. Why are you prohibiting it? But again, and I echo here, Mr. Comey, it's all about the implementation. So the groundwork is there. But now it's up to the state parties and up to the committees that have been established for it to actually carry out the work. And in relation to that, there has been now discussions on having some kind of trade policy review mechanism within the CFTA, to basically have a mechanism that is separate from the committees, to basically try to continue to say, hey, we have agreed something, and now we need to try to, is it implemented? If you have problems with implementation, what are the challenges, and so forth and so on. Because you can keep negotiating things, and the CFTA is becoming a big umbrella. But in fact, we need to start from somewhere and start implementing what we already have. So those are my 5 cents. And if there are any questions, discussions, I'm happy to engage.
Thank you very much, to Mr. Lunenberg. I would like to add just a few more notes from his bio. He contributed, conceptualized, developed, and crafted numerous negotiation outcomes at the WTO and in other trade agreements, including development on instruments to implement the ECOWAS Common External Tariff, the tariff concessions under the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the WTO Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies. Thank you very much for your insight. And now we'll start an initial round of questions and comments with our 2 panelists. So I would like to ask Mr. Tsowo if you have any questions or comments to the presentation that we have just heard, or if you would like to add anything to your presentation at this point. The floor is yours. Thank you.
So thanks again, Mr. Chair. And yes, I think the second presenter also highlights quite a number of issues. What I want to add at this stage is that we know regional integration and the AfCFTA is covering about exactly 55 African countries. And of course, we do not expect all the countries, as discussed and presented, that to be on the same page, right? And there's a process. As I said, there is this new initiative that was called Guided Trade Initiative that actually had about 7-8 countries that starting trading among themselves, applying the new tariffs, and others are also joining. So just to also make it clear that this is a process, and we do expect some countries to take time, but we do hope this is actually the way forward to implement, to integrate the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now over to my panelists, co-panelists here to the right. Anything, any further reaction or comment, question, anything you disagree about what has been said so far? Anything that was added by Mr. Sowu, or anything you would like to add further to your presentation? Otherwise, I have a few questions myself, but
well, I agree. I mean, basically, what I'm trying to bring across is the groundwork has been done, and it is a process. I totally agree. The ground and we're getting there, but of course, it's going less fast than we all think we want it to be. But I think the groundwork is there. We have a basis, So.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that next year we'll have the first review conference of the CFTA, correct? Now, many things have happened since 2019, especially COVID and the armed conflict in Ukraine. And well, it is known that this armed conflict has disrupted global grain trade, and it has affected many countries around the world in Asia and Africa, as far as I understand. There is, of course, also, and I would like to hear if you have comments on this point to both of our panelists. What role, or whether there has been any consideration about the role of external or countries external to Africa, like China, India, Turkey, Russia, the United States, European countries, in how the agribusiness in the context of this free trade agreement can improve or generate benefits, or actually deepen existing problems, given the presence of these external stakeholders, and given what has happened so far and the potential in the future years, especially considering what has happened over the past 2-3 years. So over to you, Mr. Sowu, you have any comments to these questions? Over to you, sir.
Yes, I think these are also important questions. First, what I will say is the AfCFTA is happening within the context of multilateral trading system, and we know many African countries have those bilateral trade agreements. But we have also seen a lot of interests, from those partners, outside the continent. For instance, European Union has supported, several rounds of negotiation, providing financial support to countries, for instance, to develop implementation strategies, and so many other countries. And what is also important to see is that the AfCFTA doesn't mean the investment will come also from the continent only. I said the rule of origin are clear. As far as you invest and process within the continent, you will be able to get those advantages, which also, of course, I think the recent estimate by the World Bank is that AfCFTA has a potential to increase, I think, significantly FDI by, I think it's, I will check the numbers, but there is a significant potential of the AfCFTA to be able to also attract investors, FDI from outside the continent. So I think we are seeing a lot of interest. This will also imply that the continent's businesses, and this is something we are also looking and working with business within the continent to increase their capacity to compete with others, investors within that. So in a nutshell, the capacity of the AfCFTA to attract FDI means that a lot of interest from the countries outside the continent, you have mentioned a few, are quite investing and ready also to support their businesses within this big market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lunenburg.
Yeah. Well, generally, if you look at the rules of origin, I mean, basically the rules of origins are conditions to get the tariff preference, right? So basically, it would only make sense if it would be an incentive to invest if the tariff preference is high and the rules of origin is not too strict, right? So for non-agricultural products, generally, I would say they're relatively relaxed because generally around 60% of the value added can come from outside Africa. So only 40% has to come from Africa, and it can still qualify as an African product. So I think in terms of investment, and now there has also been recently the SEZ regulation, Special Economic Zone regulation, has been adopted. So I think it offers some potential there. Of course, the risk is that you get more enclaves, right? You don't really get integrated production, but basically all the production or a lot of new production will happen in the special economic zones, which now is happening, for example, in Egypt a lot, right? I mean, new Chinese investment going to Egypt, Nigeria, Lekki port. I don't know whether so all this, in fact, all this, they are more island, investments. In the agricultural sector, because many African countries are very cognizant of the agricultural sectors. In fact, the rules of origin are quite stringent, meaning that if you manufacture chocolate, the sugar has to come from Africa. This has to come from, So increased investment would actually also, generally speaking, contribute to more intra-African value chains. The problem is that they are not liberalized, so there is no incentive, right? Because the sugar, so if you still have to pay 30% to import the sugar to make your chocolate, then it doesn't work, right? So those are my 5 cents, and I think you hit the nail. I think the review conference, or the review, I don't think it will alter the rules too much because there's so much legal development, right? I mean, we have now, the first batch of the CFTA. We have just recently 3 protocols were adopted. The one on investment, competition, and IPR. I mean, they didn't even enter into force. Then the SEZ regulation, which is part of the first batch, right? And then we have still negotiations on gender or digital trade. And then within services, there is also a whole negotiating on the service schedule, on text, on the communication, on text, on financial service. So, in fact, I don't think the CFTA itself will be significantly changed in that review conference. But I think one of your points you're raising is the influence of third-party agreements. And I think that has always been there in the back, because right now there is not even monitoring of those third-party agreements. And now post-COVID, in fact, the EU, for example, wants to start the negotiations again with ECOWAS. They are now the ministers. The recent ministerial meeting of the ECOWAS ministers, they actually agreed to explore how to negotiate with the EU, with Kenya, EU and Kenya. Of course, China, they are exploring. They're actually 5 years ago, before COVID, they were already proposing Nigeria to have a FTA similar to the one they have with Pakistan. So yes, but right now there is not really even monitoring or even some, from the CFTA. So I think that would be an area that might be part of this review process. I would actually recommend also to have it as part of that review process. So maybe we can have this. I mean, if other participants, if we wanted to draw some conclusions or recommendations from the meeting, this could be one of the recommendations.
Thank you very much. Now the mic goes all the way to the Comores. If Mr. Tsowu, you have any comment?
Not really. I know what's on the review process. There are still, discussion if it should go ahead or not, since there are a number of new protocol that just come. So my personal view will be probably to give few years, not to rush into the review, but that will again fall under the control of the Secretariat and the member states. Yeah, these are just a few points I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting comments. And now, as we're starting the last part of this panel, we'll move to our Q&A section. So we welcome questions from the floor from our online participants, English or French. The floor is open.
Hello, everybody, especially to Komi. So my name is Thomas Yapo. We collaborated in the past with WAFA. I don't know if you remember, but it was a different world back then with the, before war in Ukraine. So I have a comment concerning cocoa. First, yes, maybe there is more sugar than cocoa in chocolate. And also, maybe also European companies don't want added value to be produced in Africa. So the situation may not change. And I have a question for the two panelists. Regarding import bans, do you think it can be efficient if there is no incentive to produce agricultural products locally? What I mean is ban enough to improve local production?
Thank you. We'll get first round of questions before we hand over the mic to our panelists. Didier?
Il y a des questions.
Tous les deux. On va essayer de traduire.
Je ne sais pas si M. Commis a entendu des questions, si c'était assez fort.
So the questions, I got 3 questions. I'll start from the one, the last one, although that one, I think is not directly related to the subject matter of this panel, but if I understood correctly, it has to do with the protection of cultural goods, cultural heritage within the framework of the CFTA. So that's one of the questions I got. The other one is how the population can benefit from the CFTA and have access to market. And the first one, I'm not sure I got, it's about profitability, market profitability. Could you repeat the first question, please? So okay, so why free trade? Okay, which I think that it goes to the first point. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Before we go back to our panelists, if okay with you, do we have any other question from the floor? Il y a des questions? Oui. S'il vous plaît. A microphone for our colleague behind you.
Okay. I've been trading soft commodities during more than 25 years, mostly from Europe, from Brazil, from Central America to the entire Africa, and also exporting cocoa from Africa. And most of the time, what I see on the ground in comparison with the rules of, for example, the World Trade Organization, are totally opposed. If you look at, for example, the frozen chicken from Brazil, that is coming heavily in Africa, full of hormones, full of antibiotics, full of phytosanitary products that are forbidden, for example, here in Switzerland. I've asked several times to Pascal Lamy, at that time he was General Secretary of the World Trade Organization, why people in Switzerland, or why those chicken are not good enough for people in Switzerland and good for Africa. And he told me, you have to go to all the countries of Africa and explain what you are explaining me. I call that criminal, let's say, behavior, because when an institution, and especially when somebody at the top of those institutions doesn't want to take the common sense, the good sense, it's the rules in that case we can compare to a massive destruction weapon. Sorry. So it comes to a moment that UNCTAD, World Trade Organization, you need to take your responsibilities. Sorry to say that, because I refuse to export some goods with those kind of things. I was the first trader, and you can Google me. I was the first trader more than 20 years ago to say, and I was at that time at the biggest exporter of cocoa in Africa, EDF-Man. I've been kicked out of the company. I'm alive, so that's not a problem. But I was the first trader to say, I refuse to export cocoa where I know that the child labor has been used. You were talking about fertilizer. You have pesticides and so on that are forbidden in Europe, forbidden in other countries, but that are used in Africa. A lot of people have cancer and so on. So again, I came here in Switzerland. I went to the banks and I said, okay, you know what you are financing? And the hypocrisy is there. Okay, so again, I'm alive, but the trouble is that at that time, I also went to the UN. I also went to the World Trade Organization. Okay, so of course, it's the responsibilities of all the African countries. But as I said this morning, go to DRC and look at the laboratory of the OCC, Office Congolais de Contrôle. No electricity, a lot of things are missing. So for sure, they cannot make the same phytosanitary controls that are used here in Switzerland. Okay, so it comes to a moment that why those organizations like the World Trade Organization, UNCTAD, exist if it is for things that they perfectly know that are totally insane, criminal. Okay, finally, we have to pay taxes because we've been talking about taxes for goods, but we have to pay taxes for those institutions using their power to, and what I talked about, it was 20 years ago and it's still the same, using their power to continue things instead of stopping. It comes to a moment that when some things are totally insane, it should be in 24 hours a decision to say no. Brazil, either you change your composition of chickens and so on, either you stop.
Thank you very much. Before we continue with questions from our audience, let's go back to our panelists for their reactions and comments, and maybe they also have questions to our participants. Let's start with you, Mr. Tsuwu. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks. Can on the sequence, I think the sequence and maybe a kind of question. There was someone who asked 3 questions. On the third one was the protection of culture, but the 2 I didn't hear them. Can you summarize? Because the mic, I think there was a problem at that time. Please.
How population, how can they benefit from free trade? How a free trade agreement will bring benefits to people at the very local level.
Inclusive. Mm-hmm. So let me take those few questions. For the first one, Thomas, yes, I think it's glad to see you again here. And what I wanted to add is that when it's come to the cocoa, and I'm sure you know the market as well, quite well, and all those in Geneva and Switzerland, is that I just gave an example of cocoa, but when we look at most of the commodities, the value addition is not there. And next week, even we are going to Accra to discuss again at the Afrique annual summit how we can address those issues since Afreximbank is investing a lot in trade and of course production and trade. What I also believe is that there will be certainly value addition that will help in cocoa sector within the continent, because we are seeing a number of businesses and countries ready, to demand more. But again, when the cocoa market is quite complex, as you know, because of the competition, where you have those big players that are dominating. But let's hope and connect those market opportunities to the continent. But on the ban, what I also think is, yes, it's true that many countries in Africa tend to ban, imports of products here and there when it comes normally to vulnerability in some sectors. For instance, if they feel like the national market is threatened, by some product, they will ban it. Normally, the commitment under the AfCFTA, for instance, under those commitment, countries need to avoid banning imports just because they want to support, unless those products are part of the 3%. And the AfCFTA has also a dispute settlement mechanism country can use later if such things happen. But what we are promoting is really to avoid taking those protectionist action that goes against your commitments, at the regional level and at continental level. If we really want to integrate the continent, we need to act as a group, right? So a lot of work in that area will continue, but I don't believe banning, for instance, will necessarily promote, or add value to local production, because we can also see that what's happened, and we got a lot of questions from countries sometimes, shall I ban this import of this sector and so, but we need to also know that when some of those sectors create jobs vis-a-vis other sectors, so before banning or protecting any sectors, there is a need for more of value or analysis. For instance, I got a call when it came to 2-3 years ago from a country which has only one factory, cement factory in the country. So what they asked me, shall they protect that sector, cement sector, or shall they open it within the context of the AfCFTA? The answer is not simple. When you have one sector, cement sector, of course, creating job, you have FDI, that you have foreign investors that invested in that plant, but look at the possibility of opening that cement sector where you then have a lot of a cheaper import that will come from other countries in Africa, and then you can support easily your construction sector, for instance. So it's quite complex, but we still see a lot of countries that continue to ban import of some sort to support local production. But in a nutshell, I think what I will say is that African countries shouldn't be taking decisions that then come as opposition vis-a-vis what they have taken in an international or regional context. For the second question, il y a les questions de protection, effectivement, de culture, tout ce qui est créative, industrie créative. Il y a des discussions en cours sur certaines industries, bien évidemment dans le cadre des négociations sur les services. Mais il faut aussi voir aussi que dans le cadre de la ZLECAf, il y a un protocole sur les droits de propriété intellectuelle qui pourront effectivement contribuer à protéger certaines inventions au niveau du continent. Mais le cadre spécifique de culture, comme l'a dit le chair, n'est pas nécessairement pris en compte dans ce contexte-là, mais je pense aussi en travaillant beaucoup avec les industriels et autres, ceux qui sont dans le cadre d'industrie créative, on aura des solutions. Nous, par exemple, au niveau du PNUD, nous sommes en train de lancer un programme sur l'industrie créative, voir comment on peut aider ces acteurs-là aussi dans le cadre du continent. Et ça va au-delà de culture, ça inclut la musique, tout ce qui est industrie de cinématographie, ainsi de suite. La dernière question portant sur les questions de qualité. Effectivement, je crois que, madame, vous avez raison. Malheureusement, on retrouve au niveau du continent des fois des produits qui ne sont ni acceptés, par exemple à Genève, en Suisse ou dans d'autres. Et même au niveau de certaines représentations internationales, voilà, on ne fait pas assez. Maintenant, c'est vrai qu'on a besoin aussi, comme vous l'avez dit, que les pays, les États se dotent d'institutions de contrôle, des standards et autres de qualité pour pouvoir effectivement contrecarrer ou bien donner des arguments solides au gouvernement pour pouvoir refuser l'importation de certains produits. Il y a eu des scandales, que ce soit de poissons, de tilapia, de poulet dans certains pays. Mais malheureusement, comme vous l'avez noté, beaucoup de pays africains souffrent de déficits au niveau de ces institutions qui doivent superviser tout ce qui est qualité. Mais je pense aussi que, par exemple, AfCFTA est en train d'investir dans un laboratoire qualité énorme au niveau du Nigeria, par exemple. Chaque pays ne pourra malheureusement pas l'avoir. Il va falloir trouver quels sont les pôles régionaux où il va falloir investir. Mais c'est un problème et je pense que la société civile en fait beaucoup. Il faut continuer aussi, je pense, au niveau de la société civile, en faire. Mais il faut aussi responsabiliser les gouvernements de ces pays aussi qui envoient ces produits malheureusement vers le continent. C'est un travail de longue haleine, mais on espère qu'avec la sensibilisation de toutes les parties prenantes, on y arrivera et avec le renforcement de capacité des États africains, des institutions qui s'occupent de tout ce qui est certification, qualité, pour pouvoir aussi avoir toute la technologie nécessaire pour pouvoir répondre aux besoins de la population. Je vais m'arrêter là en espérant aussi que d'autres réponses vont venir aussi de l'autre panéliste. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Peter.
I won't be too long because I'm standing between you and the lens. So the whole idea of facilitating trade is that you could sell more to other countries, right? And then that you can maybe have more employment. But on the other hand, you can have also more imports. But then the question is also, if you reduce some taxes, right? Who is actually going to benefit? I mean, it could be that in the end, the consumers pay lower prices, but maybe the traders are pocketing actually part of the difference. So actually the outcomes are not guarantees. And I think that is why when you're implementing a free trade agreement, you need to monitor the impact. Well, as I said, right now, there are no impacts because there is largely no implementation yet. On the import bans are effective live, especially in Africa. When we were working on this ECOWAS regulation on supplementary protection measures, which was actually a demand from Nigeria to start implementing the ECOWAS Common External Tariff. Actually, in the first draft, we had put in something on import bans. But of course, in the second revision, that language was deleted because no way, you're not going to touch the decisions of Nigeria to do something on import bans. So import bans are effective live, and they are often arbitrary, they are often not announced, they are often long-term. They are effective live, but we are not trying to become, dogmatic in this. So I think it's important. I think the CFTA tries to create transparency on them by saying, okay, what are actually your import prohibitions? And to have a discussion on them. So I think that is already good. It's maybe not perfect, but it's good. And to have a discussion on why do you have these import bans, right? I mean, yeah. And on the frozen chicken, I mean, the frozen chicken has always been a problem. not only in DRC, but also in Gambia, also in South Africa. They are using, different countries are using different instruments. So South Africa tried to restrict imports with anti-dumping duties, for example, but then got defeated. I mean, there are instruments in the WTO agreements that allow governments to do import restrictions. But of course, as you point out, you need capacity for that. You need actually money to actually make use, or you need capacity to make use of this instrument to have import restrictions. In fact, this is an issue that exactly can be taken up in the CFTA, in the subcommittee that deals with this issue, because actually the CFTA says we should develop regional standards. So why not sit together, have a working group on frozen chickens and say, hey, you know, under these conditions, we import chickens unless there is a certain framework on it. I mean, nothing stops African countries from doing that. Of course, you have international rules that may or may not help, right? But nothing stops from African countries to actually come up with a framework to deal with frozen chickens, or to help countries to deal with frozen chickens that are not good for health and all of that. But you know, it takes coordination, and it takes time, and it takes effort. And there are many conflicting, many policy priorities that governments have to deal with, right? So that is often the issue. I mean, so often government officials are either doing nothing or running around like chickens. So, I mean, saying that they're too busy to do everything what is on their plate. I mean, so yeah.
Thank you. As we started a bit late, I just want to see if there is any burning question to our panelists. Yes, just very quick, please, and then we'll go back to answering that question and the final remarks from our panelists. Over to you, sir.
Not burning, but a last one. Having bad hearing, I am not sure what you all said, so I will ask a question of what I think that you all said. There is a common belief, especially in the civil society, that agricultural markets are a rip-off with huge margins for traders, and even with low margin, a price which is biased against the producer in favor of the buyer. This may be true or not. So my question will be very simple. Do people like the South Center people attend meetings like Global Grain or GrainCom or similar private sector markets where the actual actors of the commodities market are?
Thank you. So Peter, this was directed at you. So would you like to answer, or if not, just give us your final remark, if any?
Well, I think what this meeting highlights is that the benefits of trade liberalization, they might be there, but they might actually be captured by other actors, and I think we have to be cognizant of that. So I think that is what the meeting highlighted.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter. And over to our online panelist for his final remark, if any.
Thanks. I didn't get the last question quite well. I have an issue of
it was a specific question,
yes,
regarding the South Center that went to Peter.
Okay.
So any final remarks from your side?
So yeah, on the final remark, I think from wherever we are, we might work toward supporting this integrating agenda of the continent, and knowing that the AfCFTA is here to support the continent, leverage regional continental integration to be able to also better integrate the global market. So I really want to thank the organizer for this conference. And this is just starting, and we will see hopefully the AfCFTA fully implemented in not a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists, and let me ask you for a big round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you,
very
Didier.
much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mr. Suo. I think that CFTA can be a game changer in condition that we work on effective implementation. So thank you, and we have right now a lunch break, and after we come back at 2:30. That's okay. Thank you. Donc cet après-midi, on recommence à 14h30 et on va parler de l'eau.